بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، نبينا وقدوتنا محمد عليه أفضل الصلاة وأزكى التسليم. اللهم علمنا بما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everybody. Welcome. Sunday night. We're forming the self with Raghib Asfahani's book, Dhariyah ila Makarim Shariah. Last time we had talked about, or the author had talked about, essential characteristics for students. All of this is about learning, benefiting yourself with knowledge. Then you have to be prepared in order to benefit from that knowledge. And so today we're going to do a brief recap of that, and then we're also going to get into its complementary counterpart, which is essential characteristics of teachers. Right? It's a two-way street. Both sides have to have the right ingredients for a successful learning experience. So the author of Raghib al-Asfahani, he had talked about, first and foremost, what every student has to do, student of this religion and student of every other subject, is to purify themselves from poor etiquette. Purify themselves from poor etiquette. And there are several different things that count here as poor etiquette. One of the things is haste, right? It's poor etiquette for a student to have haste in the thing that they're studying. Why? Because it's implied, if you act like you can, that it's even possible to learn something in a day or a month or a year, then you're kind of implying that there's not that much to it, right? And that might apply for certain subjects, but certainly something like Islamic law, like the Quran, like Arabic, like things like this, and even other subjects such as this, medicine and engineering and these sorts of things, psychology, dealing with people, education. They're all very, very rich, involved fields that require time and practice to master, right? And so haste is bad manners. Having haste, it also overstates one's ability, right? So anybody is only able to digest a certain amount of material in a certain amount of time. You can compare it to water. The human body can only process a liter of water in an hour. So, for example, if you want to fast the following day, and you think that the hour before sunrise you're just going to drink 3 liters of water, your body's not even going to be able to process that much water, right? So knowledge is just the same. There's only so much that your mind and your soul is going to be able to process at once. And so you to be hasty and to imagine that you're able to process more than that is overstating your own powers. And then third of all, what this does, being hasty when you're seeking to learn something, is that it expresses a lack of trust in your instructor and in your teacher, because your teacher is responsible not just for the information that they are presenting to you, but they are also responsible for the pace and the scope and the amount, right? And it's true that not all teachers are good at this, right? But the fact that not all teachers are good at this does not make it, does not invalidate the appropriateness of this particular aspect of the student-teacher relationship in the first place, right? Just because some teachers are poor at communicating to their students or pacing their students or breaking it down into the proper bite-sized pieces and putting them on a good schedule, just because a teacher is good at that does not mean that the student is any better, right? And so that's just the case of both sides being at fault for the same thing. If the student is focusing on themselves, what else do they have to do? What else can they do except submit to their teacher's sense of timing and how much they're able to learn in one sitting? The second thing that comes under purifying yourself when it comes to the student and the etiquette the student has to have when they're about to learn anything, especially the religion, is to free themselves from jealousy. Jealousy is a killer when it comes to people studying anything, let alone the faith. And this is something I witnessed firsthand. And many of the, I mean, I hope you're not following any sort of the drama on social media that always is ever present, but many of the things that people claim are disagreements of fiqh or disagreements of theology or disagreements that are rooted in academics are honestly, if you go way, way back to the beginning, are actually just personal issues rooted in jealousy, right? And this is a particular danger for people who study the religious sciences because you know a certain thing and you know things and you have this sort of authority to speak for the religion. And then if you have a personal issue with somebody, it's very, very, very tempting, and the devil is going to attempt to get you to put a religious justification for your treatment of that adversary, or your mistreatment of that adversary by saying, "Oh, this person is off the path, and this person is misguided, and this person is this, and this person is that," right? Regretfully, we live in a time where that is very, very, very common. And these are things that I witnessed in Medina, and in the last class we talked about specifics, so we don't need to revisit those. The next part of purifying yourself as a student, according to the author, is focusing on your studies, not letting yourself get distracted by the world, because this world is always going to be there, right? You making your livelihood, it's never going to end. You being responsible for your children, it's never going to end. And that doesn't mean that we neglect those things, but which way is the typical way? Most people use those things as an excuse to prevent their learning, right? And so the author wants to caution us and wants to tell us that those things are not barriers for you to learn. You can't use them as excuses. You have to stay focused on your studies. You have to schedule your time well. You have to organize yourself so that you're giving everything its proper due, right? Very, very few are the people who are neglecting their livelihood and their children at the expense of their studies. Very, very many are the people who are neglecting learning for the sake of their livelihood and children, right? So you deal with the majority situation. And the majority situation calls for people to not be intimidated by their worldly responsibilities when they're going to be learning anything. The next thing that the author had said was to avoid arrogance towards your instructor and to avoid arrogance towards the subject that you're learning. And this is a huge one. Absolutely huge. The Prophet ﷺ said 2 types of people don't learn. I'm sorry, I'm not sure that this is a hadith marfu' ila Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but this is a statement of the Salaf. 2 types of people don't learn: the arrogant person and the shy person. The arrogant person doesn't think he has anything to learn, and so he's already a closed door. He's not going to be able to accept anything. He's going to always think that he knows better. And the shy person isn't going to learn because that's the opposite side of the same pride, right? Somebody who's shy, too shy to ask questions, too shy to make a mistake, too shy to get it wrong and be corrected. This person is just as prideful as the first type, but they're reacting to it in the opposite way by just kind of trying to fly low and fly under the radar. And we saw that. We witnessed that when we were abroad as students, and we saw people studying the Arabic language. The people who progressed the quickest and the people who learned the most are the people that just, let's do it, crash and burn. Just threw themselves out there, let themselves make mistakes, and allow themselves to be corrected. And that's the way to learn. So that's one type of arrogance. The other part of the arrogance is arrogance to the subject. It goes together, this and the last point. You need help, right? If you want to learn anything, you need help. You're not going to just be able to sit in the comfort of your own home or your living room or your bedroom and figure it out all on yourself. There's been thousands and thousands and thousands of people that have done it before you, right? It would be silly and counterproductive to not benefit from the work of those people. They will tell you the things to avoid, the things that they are the happiest that they did, and so on and so forth. And with us in studying Islam, the most successful of us, we tried to listen very carefully to what the guys who went before us said. Like, what did you regret? I always particularly ask people about their regrets. If you could do it all over again, what would you do different? Because people tend to be very, very honest when it comes to the things that they regret. So you avoid arrogance to your instructor, right? Your instructor, unless they're a phony, we're talking about a real deserving instructor, knows more than you do. They've been around the block a few times. Don't think, oh, why does he only give me a little bit? Why doesn't he, do this? Why doesn't he do that? It would be more beneficial if he taught this way. You don't know what you're talking about, right? He knows the subject and you don't. So if he's making a decision, if he's a qualified teacher, a good teacher, he's making a decision for a reason. He's leaving something out for a reason because he thinks you're not ready for it, or because there's prerequisites that you haven't covered yet, etc., etc. And you can't be arrogant to your subject. You have to respect it. You have to understand that it's a serious thing, that it's going to take time, and that you're going to need to rely on other people to get it done. It's cooperation, not competition. You've got to cooperate with the right people to get to the goal. And you have to stand on the shoulders of the people who come before you and the people in your life who want to help you get there, right? Um, okay, we talked about that. We talked about that. And obviously in the Quran, we have an example with Musa and Khidr, alayhim salam, right? Moses doesn't chill at home waiting for Khidr to come to him to teach him, right? He goes out and he tracks him down. And even then he promises, I'm going to follow you. And he makes a promise to Khidr. He says to him, if I contradict you, right, then be done with me. And Musa can't even help himself. He contradicts Khidr, as we know the story very well, 3 times. And then Khidr says, okay, listen, you can't learn from me anymore. So that is kind of a archetype, right? That's like the model for the student-teacher relationship. Then the author had said that the student has to be docile by the literal meaning of the word, and that means that they have to be coachable. They have to be willing to be molded and to be changed. You can't expect, and this is a very similar thing to what we just mentioned, you can't go into it just saying, well, I'm just going to get this one thing that I think I need, and then the rest, like whatever, this guy. No, you have to be open to letting yourself be transformed and be changed. It's like fertile ground upon which rain falls. The information or the knowledge that you're seeking is like rain, and you are the soil. So if you're rocky and barren and you think that you've got it figured all out, then you're not going to benefit. Nothing's going to grow. Whereas if you make yourself available, you open yourself up to being amended and being changed, then the knowledge will bear fruit. And this is the difference between learning your religion from YouTube and learning your religion from actual people who study. Because when you go to YouTube or any of the other social media platforms to teach yourself anything, especially the religion, it's similar to somebody who's sick going into a pharmacy and just raiding the shelves, right? You're assuming that you know what's wrong with you. You're assuming that you've diagnosed yourself, that you know what's wrong, that you know what's the best thing to take, right? Which is a mistake because you don't know all the contraindications. Maybe you've got a history of this particular illness in your family that you can't take this type of medicine. Maybe you've got an allergy that needs to be taken into account. Maybe this type of medicine is nullified or the effects of it is rendered nothing by this other thing that you're already taking, right? That's the whole reason that you need a pharmacist to be able to tell you which medicine is the best for you as an individual to take. It's the same thing with the religion. You go onto YouTube, you click this link, you click that link, you're making the decision, you're putting yourself in the driver's seat of what you think you need to hear, right? And then YouTube, as the algorithm, is just going to throw back to you more confirmation. It's like, oh, you like that? Then you'll also like this, right? Whereas a teacher, the difference between a real living teacher is that the teacher is going to dictate the schedule, the pace, what comes next, priorities, priorities, priorities. No, this thing is not a priority. You have to do this first, or this much more important that you focus on this particular thing now, then rather than doing it later down the road. And this is, obviously, this gets into a perfect segue into the next chapter, which is when the author's talking about, okay, those are all the things that a student has to have to be successful. What about teachers? Because yes, there are phony teachers out there, and there are teachers that do more harm than good. And we talked a little bit a couple classes ago about those types of teachers, and we're going to discuss it again today, inshallah. So the teacher, they have to treat their students like their own children, right? So if parents are supposed to be the source of your material life, your clothes, your food, your shelter, etc., then good teachers are supposed to be the source of your afterlife. At least we're talking about studying the religion, right? They're supposed to teach you the things that you need to know to ease your salvation and your delivery and your passage into the next life and into Jannah, inshallah. They need to have compassion and mercy, right? Sometimes you see some teachers that are way too hard and strict, and everything's about, I mean, this is mostly in the old country where people getting whooped and people getting beaten and the belt and the chains and all this crazy stuff, you know? Um, that's not the way. That wasn't the way of the Prophet ﷺ. That wasn't the way of the companions. And people might say that, oh, well, we have cultural issues and that's et cetera, et cetera. But I don't know. Consider me doubtful. Teachers have to be compassionate. They have to have mercy. Yet they have to be concerned and they have to be vigilant, right? They have to see 3, 5, 10 steps ahead. They need to, if their student has a certain doubt or something that they're not understanding or something that is vexing them, is causing them, dis-ease, then they need to be attentive to that. They can't just abandon the student on their own and let them to figure it out on their own, go to YouTube, go to Facebook or something else. They need to be attentive to that. That's the teacher's responsibility. And a teacher needs to be caring and concerned about his students, because what is a teacher without his students, right? A teacher without a student is like a person without any lineage, right? All that knowledge, all that stuff that you went and you tried to learn, and at the end of the day, it died with you, right? What's the point? The knowledge lives on. The teacher, and this is a huge thing that is neglected today, is that the teacher, the author says, has to facilitate cooperation and love between his students. Yes. How many times? And we're talking Mecca, we're talking Medina, we're talking every place in the Muslim world. Does the sheikh not have any relationship with his students, to the point where there's rivalries and there's feuds and there's jealousy and there's all this other stuff that goes on in between the students? And this is a horrible, horrible thing, and I've seen it firsthand. And there's a concept in the old country, or at least in the Arab lands, where they say haiba, right? They put a lot of emphasis on a teacher's mystique, right? The teacher or the sheikh, he's supposed to be somebody who's so far above us that he only interacts with us in a very curated way, right? You only see him in very formal situations. He might not know, even like, he might even not know your first name. If he knows your first name, he doesn't know, this about you, or what you're going on, or where you're coming from, or how many kids you have, et cetera, et cetera. That's a mistake, in my personal opinion. I understand letting teachers have their respect. I understand the creating of the mystique around a teacher to kind of make this sort of attractiveness, but it can have negative consequences. And one of the negative consequences is that the teacher doesn't know what the students are doing. And so the students are not putting his lessons into practice, if he's a good teacher, not caring for each other, not cooperating with each other, the opposite. Everything's drama. It's a distraction. It's filled with, backbiting and sabotage, and et cetera, et cetera. And that is a tragedy. And that happens everywhere. It certainly happens in Medina. So the teacher, a good teacher, is responsible. The good teacher knows his students, knows the situation of his students, and actively, proactively tries to facilitate love and cooperation between those students, because the students together cooperating are going to benefit way more than any one of them individually just doing whatever they can by themselves, right? We had this idea back in Medina that we never put into practice, but we really liked the idea, where most scholars, they would teach their classes between Maghrib and Isha. It's only an hour and a half. And so if you were a good student and a vigilant student, it wasn't possible to attend all of the lectures and all of the things that you wanted to. So what we thought about doing, and we never implemented, regrettably, was we wanted to make like a collective or a cooperative, where every individual student goes to a certain scholar for a certain thing, takes notes, and then shares the notes with the group. So then even if everybody's only attending one specific lesson, it's as if everybody's at least able to benefit from the Cliffs Notes or the outlines from everybody else. approaching things cooperatively. Like that's the way. And that starts with the teacher. The teacher is the one who is responsible for trying to develop that ethos between his students, and something that we are very much in need of today. The teacher is also responsible for guiding the student gradually from the worst to the best, right? And that's not a one-step process. Like people don't understand, right? Especially as an imam, I can tell you, you get people that come to you and their lives are very real. You've got people engaged in all types of sin, and you can't throw everything at them at once. They need to be given a path of progress. They need to be given a ladder to climb. And certain things take priority over other things, right? There was one of the brothers that was talking with a convert, or a potential convert, I should say, someone who was interested in converting to Islam. And they had a girlfriend, right? And they were very, very, like it wasn't one of those casual dating things. It was like a serious, serious girlfriend. Years they had been together, right? And someone had told this individual that there are no girlfriends and boyfriends in Islam. There's no dating. You either marry or you get out of there, which is technically true. It's technically true. We don't do the dating thing as mainstream society does, right? We believe that all sexual relationships, intimate, romantic relationships need to happen within the context of marriage in order to protect both people's rights, right? That is true in and of itself. However, is that something that somebody should make their decision to embrace Islam off of or not? Is that person ready to hear that? In this case, this individual was not ready to hear it. And so they asked the person that was speaking to them, they said, like, I heard this thing, like, what do you think about it? And the brother, may Allah bless him, he hesitated. He sensed that this was a really, really tricky situation. And he kind of like bought for time or whatever, played for time. But eventually he ended up saying to him, it's like, no, you can't really have girlfriends in Islam or whatever. And so he never saw the guy again. The guy never ended up becoming a Muslim. He never converted, etc., etc. Right? This is a shame. It's a shame because if Allah can get someone, if Allah can bring someone through the door, then Allah can guide someone after that. Right? The person doesn't need to know about girlfriends, boyfriends right away. They don't. And that doesn't have anything to do with lying. It doesn't have anything to do with misleading. It's just about taking into account where people are at and getting people, giving people what's better for them instead of holding them to this ideal of what's perfect and what's the best, right? It's better that that person became a Muslim and lived in sin, having a girlfriend, than he stay not a Muslim and still have his girlfriend anyway, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can forgive anything that he wants to when it comes to the day of judgment, right? But if the person they were leaned or inclined towards Islam and they never embraced it in the first place, then we fear for that person in the afterlife, and Allah knows best. So the teacher is responsible for pacing, for putting things one foot in front of the other. And this is another thing that we find is a huge problem. You got people becoming Muslim every day in America, and not so much teachers, but the Muslim masses throw everything at once on the new convert. Well, you gotta change your name, and you gotta quit your job, and you gotta dump your girlfriend, and you gotta like sell your dog or whatever, right? You throw all this stuff on somebody the second they walk in the door, and you're not going to see that person again, except for the rare person, rare person. That's not how the Prophet ﷺ dealt with people. That's not how the companions dealt with people, and that's not how teachers or the Muslim masses should deal with people. They need to take things one step at a time. They need to be willing to buy for time and exchange something bad for something that's less bad, and then something that's less bad for something that's just a little bit bad, and then something that's a little bit bad for something that's okay, and etc., etc. We have someone in the community that, they're from a culture where they have the Sweet 16, right? It's like a big deal. It's not a birthday party. Like you can't even translate it as a birthday party. It's like a coming of age event, right, for this particular ethnicity and this particular heritage. And so, if she, this person came to me and they're like, can we do like an Islamic version of this? right? And basically my question was, well, what else are you going to do if I say no? And then the answer is, well, we're probably going to have to go do it in church, because I can't imagine telling my parents that I'm not going to have it done. So if the alternative is to go to the church and to do it with the cross and to do it with the this and that and all this sort of stuff, then I would rather come to the masjid, right? I will read some Quran. I will make some speech about, the importance of Islam and treating your parents right and all this nice stuff. And it could be dawah, etc., etc. Then really die on this hill. We're talking about as an individual, for this individual, it's not the battle to pick, right? This person's a dependent. This person's not an adult yet. This person's, got all these other sort of circumstances. Sometimes you have to be willing to deal with something that's less bad than fight for the ideal right away. You live to play another day. And this is something that Sheikh Abdullah, my teacher in Medina, used to stress to us all the time. He used to give the example of Umar, radiallahu anhu, when he was the leader after the Prophet ﷺ died. There was someone who was one of these local chiefs in Sham, who, like the Syria, Iraq, Turkey area. And the companions, when they got to him, he said, I'm thinking about becoming a Muslim, but I want you to write a letter to Umar and tell him that I'll become a Muslim if I can be the king after he dies. Right? And the companions were shocked, because, this is some really brazen stuff. And so they write back, they said, like, well, we can't just like go ahead and say, yeah, we got to write back to Umar and like see what he says. And so they write back to Umar and see what he says. And the letter comes. And in the meantime, when they were waiting for the response, this individual passed away, right? And he passed away as a non-Muslim. And then they got the letter from Umar. And Umar apparently had said, tell him he can have it. Tell him he can have it. Because I hope that if Allah brings him into faith, like the very, very lower rungs of faith, that Allah will continue to guide him after that. And that's really, this needs to be distinguished. This is distinguished from what the Christians have done historically, which is manipulate and change their religion in order to satisfy what people want. That's different, right? So the Christians had this test very, very early on when it came to dealing with the Greeks, and the Greeks had no idea what circumcision was, very, very foreign to them. And they wrote back, and there was this big debate between the early church fathers and the early apostles of the church, some of whom were actual companions and disciples of Jesus, alayhi salam. And they debated what to do, whether to, have the people circumcised or to not have the people circumcised. And essentially what they decided was to not have them circumcised, tell them that it was just fine what they were doing. And the whole religion changed. And that was actually one of the key moments in the history of Christianity that set the precedent for that type of thing further down the road. So that's when you find that the Christians, they incorporated pagan holidays and Christianized them, and they did all these sorts of things to just appease the idolaters and the pagans that they came across. And in the process, they lost their own religion. This is not the same thing. This is not the same thing. We are leaving Islam as it is. We're saying that, no, this is Islam. Islam says no intimate relationships outside of marriage. Islam says no this, no that, or it says to do this, says to do that. But we are willing to tolerate a certain individual persisting in that pre-Islamic practice until we believe that they are ready to receive the truth about that sort of thing, right? Two very, very different things. So hopefully everyone's able to distinguish between those two things. The other thing, okay, so next, is my connection okay? Sheikh family, you see, I see I'm freezing up once in a while. Am I good? Just tell me in the chat. The next thing that the author says, okay, how does the teacher interact with his students? How does he get them, bring them along? Okay, thank you. The author now says that it's best that the teacher teaches his students through implicit instruction as opposed to explicit instruction. Okay, so instead of spelling everything out in fine detail, he said that it's preferable if the teacher can be subtle enough and gentle enough and implicit enough to get the students to think for themselves, right? And so he lists now a bunch of benefits to this sort of method, right? We could maybe call it the Socratic method, right? The Socratic method of instruction. You assume that the student has the answer in them somehow. They have not yet just connected the dots, right? And so you kind of work from what they already agree to and understand. You ask questions that are very, very probing questions that get them to think and then get them to connect the dots themselves. Yes, exactly. So one of the benefits of this, says the author, is that it facilitates true understanding as opposed to just memorization, right? What do we do when we bring the kids in for Sunday school? The 5 pillars of Islam, the testimony of faith, and the prayer, and right? And they memorize it, and okay, it's good, they know it, okay, but do they really understand it? Do they really understand the significance of it, right? Because if you ask a child, it's like, why is it important that there's no God but Allah? How can we tell? How many gods are there? And what would be the consequences if there were only one God versus if there were multiple gods? Then you not just tell someone what's the right answer, you get them to come to the conclusion themselves and to understand why. And you can use things from the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says that if there were multiple gods, you would see chaos in the creation, because the definition of multiple gods would imply that there would be multiple wills, and multiple wills would argue and dispute and come into contradiction with each other. And so you would find that there would be chaos in the creation. And we do not find that at all. We find unity, we find harmony, we find peace, we find laws and order and organization, right? And so you can use this rationale and reasoning to guide someone to come to the conclusion on their own that there can only be one God. And why is it necessary that we have revelation? Why is it necessary that we have prophecy, etc., etc.? What's the scope of human reasoning? How much stuff can we really figure out on our own? Can we really figure out what happens after the human soul is removed from the body? Can we really figure out what happens when we die? Can we really figure out what happens on the day of judgment, or if there's a day of judgment, or, all those sorts of things? No, of course we can't, which is why we depend upon revelation. So if you teach implicitly, you get somebody to affirm those things themselves. It not only is better than memorization in that it's going to stick longer and stronger in the mind, but the person knows why, and they understand why, and they're able now to accommodate and deal with and account for every other way of understanding the universe. Someone comes to them and tries to tell them that, oh no, this God stuff and this religion is just ancient fables, and it's just stories that people have made up, and whatever. That person has gone through the intellectual process of understanding why this stuff makes sense, and they'll be less susceptible to that sort of doubt than somebody who simply, quote unquote, knows the right answer, right? Was able to get the right answer on the Sunday school test by saying, oh, the 5 pillars of Islam are X, Y, Z, etc., etc. And that's just basic education and pedagogy. Everybody who studies anything with education knows that it's better to facilitate their own students' conclusion than to just spoon feed them the conclusion yourselves. The author says that this process is more honorable. It's more honorable for the student and for the teacher. It respects the student's intelligence, right? It respects the student's identity or reality as a thinking person who already comes to the table with information and skills and abilities, right? And it respects the teacher more, because it's beneath the teacher to have to just spoon feed and these sorts of things and just say this is this and just memorize it and then you're done. That's a waste of time, right? And as a teacher myself, I can tell you that it's much, much more engaging to be involved in a conversation with somebody who's trying to come to these conclusions themselves than to just try to be telling someone the right answers that they have to memorize. Explicitness or spoon feeding, that one of the weaknesses of it, the author points out, is that it only has one dimension, right? If I tell you that the first pillar of Islam is the testimony of faith, it's unidimensional. It's cut and dry and it stops there. Whereas if I ask the question, I try to teach implicitly. I say, how can we tell if there's a God or not? How can we tell that if there is a God, there's only one versus multiple? It opens up all of these threads of inquiry, all of these questions. All of a sudden, there's a whole network of thoughts, questions, examples that come up, and it's a much more enriching experience for the student. Um, and the last thing that the author mentions, and this is true for anybody who's a parent, says explicit instruction invites contradiction and conflict and opposition from the student, whereas implicit instruction does not. And this comes back to the honor. So you tell your son or you tell your daughter, this is this. What's your son going to say? No, it's not. Isn't that always how they respond? That's how I responded when I was a teenager. No, it's not. I would argue with you until I was blue in the face that the sky was purple. I did not care. I just wanted to argue. That's especially for, I can't speak for women, but for men, it's about proving yourself. It's about proving your abilities. It's about, carving your own identity, et cetera, et cetera. So if you are going to go with the spoon feeding methodology of instruction, you're going to find that at a certain point, you're going to be up against a lot of opposition. There are going to be some students who they want to prove you wrong, and they will do anything to prove you wrong because they're trying to carve out that kind of identity for themselves. The solution is not to crush them and crush their will. No, you've got to take that and you've got to apply that in an arena where it's actually beneficial. And what could be better for them is trying to teach implicitly through questions. It's like, okay, I get it. You're smart. Well, then why is this? What do you think about this? Right? Why do if somebody says that we don't need revelation? Like why? Or somebody claims that, there's reincarnation, right? Or that God became a human being on earth, right? What would we say to that person? Or why does that make sense or not make sense? Right? This is something that's going to, there's nothing to push back against. There's no opposition to be had, right? Now it's collaboration. Now it's you are working together with the student to come to a conclusion, as opposed to you trying to give something to the student like medicine, and then the kid shutting his mouth and turning away and running and saying, nope, it doesn't taste good. I don't want it. And the last thing, and I guess we'll end with this because the time's running out, is that the teacher has to do it for the right reasons. And this should be put up in lights, put up on the wall. This is the first thing. A teacher, if they're going to be a good teacher, has to do it for the right reasons. They have to want what's good for the student. They have to want to build independent thinkers, people who are going to be able to not be dependent on the sheikh, not have to ring them up every 5 seconds. And we're not talking about, we're talking about like eventually, somebody who's serious. We're not talking about a one-off, question. Somebody who wants to learn the religion from this sheikh, right? The idea, the sheikh's got to be able to put that person on a track, on a path where they're going to be developing their own skills so that one day they spread their wings and fly. And yes, they're going to, if they come across something that confuses them, refer back and ask, but it's not. And a lot of people have abused this these days in the time that we live in, where they make it seem like people who are studying the religion are never meant to think independently. Well, what do the scholars say? Well, you have to bring everything back to the scholars, and well, the scholars say this and the scholars say that, and everything, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The scholars are in the business of trying to make independent thinkers and their own scholars, right? At some point, the young generation is going to have to take over, right? And that should come at a process. That's right, exactly. A good teacher, a good instructor, or parent prepares that student or that young person for situations so that they can handle them by themselves, on their own. The idea is never, and was never, to have that person constantly dependent upon you. Oh, the sheikh, I heard this, and what do you think about this? And every single little issue. Whoever wants to perpetuate that type of dynamic, they have an ego problem. They have an ego problem. And we talked about this before, that there's two extremes here. Is that there's some people who want to keep the Muslim community dumb and uneducated so that they can just control them. You know, it's like give them little bits of, disconnected information that doesn't really build anything, doesn't build independent thinkers, doesn't build people who can interact with the Quran or the Hadith and do things, independently. That's right. They're not always going to be there for you, right? And there's this kind of hypocrisy, where people imagine, where do you think these scholars come from in the first place? You think that their teachers taught them to always, always, always ask them? And there's a romanticism. I get it. Like Ibn al-Qayyim, for example, he was a student of Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah until Shaykh al-Islam died, right? And Ibn al-Qayyim was a very, very advanced student at that point. He was a scholar in his own right, but he wouldn't answer questions until Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah passed away. That's romantic. That's very nice. That's very beautiful. But not every single situation has to be that way. We can't impose this wara, right? This going above and beyond, as every single student-teacher relationship has to mimic this sort of thing. And that if anybody starts teaching or if anybody starts expressing their own opinions before they're 60 years old or before they're 80 years old or before they're, decrepit and, being pushed around in a wheelchair, then all of a sudden that this person is, disrespectful to the scholars. And no. That's not what it is. That's not the way it goes. So people have to have the right intentions. The teacher has to have the right intention. He can't keep his students in a perpetual state of dependency, right? And he simultaneously can't make his students discouraged. You have some people, they want to learn and they say, well, you can't, whatever, you have to study this one book for 30 years and every single explanation of it before you can even whatever. That's discouraging, it's unnecessary, and it's gatekeeping, right? Allah can put blessing whenever he wants to put. And whoever wants to come to you to learn, you have to teach them. And you have to teach them with a sincere heart. And the marker and the measure of who's sincere and who's not sincere is that a sincere teacher is going to cheer on their student and hope that that student surpasses them one day. And a sincere student is going to cheer on their other students and be happy from their other students' success and hope that their other fellow students are going to surpass them one day, right? Whereas the sick heart, the sick soul, the jealous soul wants to always keep everybody else down, wants to keep everybody else in their place, is always kind of looking out to make sure that they're the headshot or they're the top sheikh or the top most knowledgeable person around, or they're the most knowledgeable student or the best student, etc., etc. No. It doesn't work like that. And this is why, well, just the last point here, and we're already over time. This is why that masjids have to figure it out when it comes to financial structures and incentive structures, right? You can't have an imam or a teacher in a place where there's a conflict of interest, right? You have to pay the imam, pay the teachers well enough as a base salary, and not sort of these kinds of fee-based things where you can't create. What I mean to say is you can't create a situation where the imam has a financial incentive to keep people uneducated or to keep people at a basic level of knowledge. You have to take care of the imam so he's free to teach people as much as he wants and he can take people to the top. And he has to not look over his shoulder and worry that he's going to get the boot one day because he taught people everything he knew, right? And that's something that masjids are starting to figure out and have to continue to figure out. So that reaches the end of what we have time for. Are there any questions? Anybody before we conclude? I mean, yeah. Okay. Alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum.